Today we're going over the most insane war tactics in history that actually worked. Hannibal at Cannae. It's August 2nd, 216 BC, and the Roman Republic is having the worst year of its existence. For 2 years, a Carthaginian general named Hannibal Barca has been marching through the heart of Italy completely unopposed and has not lost a single battle. At the Trebia River, he ambushed a Roman army in freezing water at dawn and destroyed it. At Lake Trasimenish, he hid an entire army of 40,000 men in the fog along a hillside and waited for the Romans to march into the trap below. 15,000 Romans died in less than 4 hours. Their commander's head was never found. Rome was starting to genuinely panic. And so, the Senate did what Rome always did when its back was against the wall. They raised the largest army the Republic had ever assembled in its entire history: 80,000 infantry, 6,000 cavalry. 2 sitting consuls, Lucius Aemilius Paulus and Gaius Terentius Varro, commanded them jointly. They were going to march south to the town of Cannae in Apulia, find Hannibal's army of roughly 50,000, and end this nightmare once and for all through sheer, overwhelming, suffocating force. The Romans had a battle doctrine that had made them the dominant military power in the Mediterranean world for years. They packed their infantry into a dense, deep formation in the center of the battlefield. More men, more mass, more forward pressure. The idea was brutally simple. You concentrate your weight into a fist, you drive that fist into the enemy center hard enough, and the line collapses. It had worked against the Gauls, against the Samnites, against the Greeks, and against nearly everyone who had ever stood in front of them. Rome had built an empire on this exact idea. Hannibal knew this. He had studied it, and he was counting on them doing exactly that. On the morning of August 2nd, the two armies took the field on a flat, open plain beside the Ophitis River. This was the perfect terrain for the Romans. No hills, no forests, no terrain features to disrupt their advance. Just flat, open ground stretching in every direction, ideal for driving a massive infantry block forward and crushing whatever was in front of it. But Hannibal had arranged his army in a formation no Roman commander had ever seen before. He placed his weakest troops, his Gauls and Spanish infantry, directly in the center of his line, and he pushed that center forward, curving it toward the Romans in a convex bulge, like the belly of a bow drawn toward the enemy. On the flanks, he positioned his elite African infantry, his most experienced veterans, and on the far wings, he placed his devastating Numidian cavalry and his heavier allied horsemen. The Roman commanders looked at this arrangement and saw exactly what Hannibal needed them to see: a weak, vulnerable center practically begging to be hit. The trumpets sounded, and the Romans did exactly what they always did. They drove their enormous infantry mass forward into Hannibal's center with everything they had, and the center began to give way. The Gauls and Spaniards fell back under the Roman pressure, and the forward bulge slowly flattened, then reversed, curving inward as the Romans pushed deeper and deeper. This was working. This was exactly how Rome fought: push, drive, collapse, win. What the Roman commanders did not understand, and would not understand until it was catastrophically too late, was that the retreat of Hannibal's center was not a collapse. It was the closing mechanism of a trap that had been designed weeks in advance and was now working exactly as intended. As the Romans drove deeper into that bending center, laser focused on the infantry in front of them, Hannibal's African veterans on both flanks pivoted sharply inward and began attacking the Roman formation from both sides simultaneously. At the same moment, his cavalry, having already routed the Roman horsemen on the wings, swung around behind the Roman army and sealed the rear completely. 80,000 Roman soldiers were now entirely encircled on all 4 sides, and the circle was getting smaller by the minute. What happened next was not a battle in any conventional sense. The Romans were packed so tightly together in that shrinking perimeter that soldiers in the center could not raise their arms to swing their weapons. They could not maneuver or retreat. They could only stand there, pressed against each other, while Hannibal's men cut into them from every direction at once. Ancient sources, including the historian Polybius, who interviewed survivors, record that between 47,500 and 70,000 Roman soldiers died that afternoon, in a single day, in just a few hours. To put that in perspective, the United States lost approximately 58,000 soldiers across the entire Vietnam War. Rome lost that many men before dinner on Tuesday, August 2nd, 216 BC. The Senate received the news and sat in stunned silence. 2 consuls had led the greatest army Rome had ever raised directly into a perfectly engineered killing machine, and the man who built it had done so with a smaller force, on a battlefield the Romans had chosen themselves. Military academies around the world still study the Battle of Cannae today, not as a curiosity, not as a footnote, but as a foundational text on what military genius actually looks like when it's stripped of everything except pure tactical thinking. Hannibal didn't beat Rome by being stronger. He beat Rome by understanding exactly how Romans thought, exactly what they would do when they saw what he showed them, and building a trap so perfectly calibrated to their own doctrine that their greatest strength became the instrument of their destruction. Our next story is about the Mongols. Genghis Khan built the largest contiguous land empire in the history of the world. At its peak, the Mongol Empire stretched from the Pacific coast of China to the borders of Central Europe, covering roughly 24 million square kilometers, which is more territory than any land empire before or since. And he built it with a cavalry force that, by any conventional military logic, should not have been able to defeat the settled civilizations and professional armies that stood in his way. Cities with walls, kingdoms with heavy armored cavalry, fortifications and garrisons built specifically to repel nomadic raiders. And yet, kingdom after kingdom, army after army, fell to the Mongols in campaigns of almost incomprehensible speed and efficiency. And one of the primary reasons why this happened was because of a maneuver so simple, it sounds almost insulting when you describe it. A maneuver so brutally effective in execution that their enemies knew it was coming, had been warned about it, had seen it before, and still could not stop falling for it. It was called the feigned retreat, and the concept on paper is straightforward. A portion of the Mongol cavalry makes contact with the enemy, engages briefly, and then turns and runs. Not a full army collapse, not a rout, just a visible, convincing withdrawal, moving fast enough to look like genuine panic, but slow enough to be followed by enemy soldiers who believe they are winning. And the enemy, seeing Mongols fleeing, would do what armies across every culture and every era have always done when they think they have the upper hand. They would break formation and chase. This was the last mistake they would ever make, because the retreating Mongols were not running away. They were running to a specific location, chosen in advance, where additional Mongol units were already concealed and waiting. The moment the pursuing enemy rode into that ground, the retreating cavalry would split apart and wheeled hard to the flanks. The hidden units would rise from the terrain and hit from the front and sides, and the enemy soldiers, now strung out over a long chase, horses exhausted, formations completely broken, found themselves surrounded by fresh forces attacking from multiple directions at once with no warning and no time to respond. The execution of this maneuver required something that is genuinely rare in military history. It required extraordinary discipline under pressure. The soldiers performing the retreat could not actually run. They had to move at a controlled pace, drawing the enemy far enough from their own lines that retreat became impossible. Lead them to the exact right piece of terrain, maintain the appearance of panic without becoming panicked, and then, on signal, reverse completely and attack without hesitation. They did this against the Jin dynasty in northern China, against the Khwarezm Empire, one of the most powerful Islamic kingdoms of the 13th century, whose Shah had an army of 400,000 men and still couldn't stop the Mongols from dismantling his entire empire in less than 2 years. Against the armies of Poland and Hungary in the spring of 1241, where two separate Mongol forces, conducting two separate campaigns on opposite sides of a mountain range, executed the feigned retreat on the same week and won both battles simultaneously. At the Battle of Mohi in Hungary, Mongol commander Subutai allowed the Hungarian army of 100,000 men to believe they had the Mongols surrounded. He deliberately left a gap in his encirclement. The Hungarians, seeing an opening, began to retreat through it. What they didn't know was that Subutai had positioned his best cavalry outside that gap specifically to run down a fleeing army. The Hungarians escaped the encirclement directly into a killing ground Subutai had prepared for exactly that outcome. The feigned retreat worked not simply because it was clever. It worked because the Mongols trained for it with a relentlessness that set them apart from virtually every other military force of their era. Every warrior understood his role in the maneuver. Every horse was conditioned to respond precisely. The coordination required to execute a controlled false retreat under live battlefield conditions, under fire while being pursued, while maintaining exact speed and direction to lead an enemy to a specific predetermined location, was the product of years of drilling on the steppes of Mongolia before a single foreign campaign ever began. Genghis Khan understood something that most commanders throughout history have resisted accepting. Discipline in retreat is harder to build than discipline in advance. Most armies can be trained to charge. Almost none can be trained to run away convincingly, on purpose, under control, in the direction they choose. The army that masters both directions of movement owns the battlefield in a way that no amount of armor or fortification can answer. Our final story is one you would never believe actually happened, but it did. The Ghost Army. It is the summer of 1944, and the Allied liberation of Nazi-occupied Europe is underway. D-Day has happened. The beaches of Normandy have been taken at enormous cost, and the Allies have a foothold in France. Somewhere in the French countryside, a convoy of American military vehicles is rolling down a road in broad daylight. Tanks, half-tracks, artillery pieces, jeeps, the markings of a well-known American division visible on every vehicle. Thousands of soldiers moved through villages, setting up camps and running radio communications. A substantial and very visible armored force repositioning for what appears to be a significant offensive operation. Guess what? None of it is real. The tanks are inflatable rubber decoys. The vehicles are painted canvas stretched over wooden frames. The radio traffic is being generated by a small team of specialists impersonating an entire division's worth of communications. And the thousands of soldiers are actually 1,100 men whose job is not to fight the Germans, but to make the Germans believe they are being watched by an army that does not exist. This was the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, officially classified for 50 years after the war ended, known today as the Ghost Army. The unit was the brainchild of military planners who understood that in modern warfare, where aerial reconnaissance and signals intelligence allowed commanders to track enemy force movements in near real time, the ability to show an enemy something false could be just as valuable as any physical weapon. If you could make the Germans believe a large Allied force was massing in one location, you could hold German troops in armor in place defending against a threat that didn't exist, while the real Allied operation happened somewhere else entirely. To pull this off, they didn't recruit traditional combat soldiers. They recruited artists, architects, set designers and sound engineers, men from the New York art scene, from design schools, from theater and film, men who understood how things looked, how spaces felt, and how to construct a convincing illusion under real-world conditions. Among the unit's members were future fashion designer Bill Blass and painter Ellsworth Kelly, who would both go on to have significant careers after the war, careers they built without ever being able to mention what they had actually done in Europe. The Ghost Army operated on 3 simultaneous levels of deception. The first was visual: inflatable rubber tanks, artillery pieces, trucks, and aircraft that a small team could unpack, inflate, and position across a field in a matter of hours. From German aerial reconnaissance photography, these decoys were effectively indistinguishable from the real equipment. An empty field could become a fully staged armored division assembly area overnight, and German photo interpreters studying reconnaissance images would report a major force buildup at exactly the location the Ghost Army wanted them to report. The second was sonic. The unit operated large speaker systems mounted on half-tracks capable of broadcasting recorded sounds across distances of up to 15 miles. The sounds of tank engines, of vehicles moving, of soldiers setting up camp, of engineering equipment, bridge-building operations, the full acoustic signature of a division-sized force preparing for operations, projected across empty terrain in the middle of the night to convince German listening posts that something significant was happening in a place where there was nothing at all. The third was signals, a dedicated team of radio operators whose entire function was to impersonate the communications traffic of real Allied units. Every division in the Allied Army had its own identifiable patterns of radio communication, its own rhythms, its own operators with recognizable sending styles. The Ghost Army's signal team studied these patterns and reproduced them with sufficient accuracy that German signal intelligence analysts tracking Allied radio traffic would report the presence of entire divisions that had never moved. They conducted over 20 operations between 1944 and 1945 across France, Luxembourg, Belgium, and Germany. At the Siege of Brest, they simulated an additional armored division to confuse German defenders about the direction and weight of the Allied assault. Near the Belgian town of Vielsalm, during the aftermath of the Battle of the Bulge, they impersonated the 75th Infantry Division to screen the movement of real Allied forces repositioning after the German offensive. And in March of 1945 at Operation Viersen, in the days before the Allied crossing of the Rhine River, the Ghost Army staged one of its largest and most consequential operations, impersonating 2 full divisions along a stretch of the Rhine to draw German artillery and defensive attention away from the actual crossing points being prepared upstream. Military historians assessing the operation have estimated it saved thousands of American lives by pulling German fire and resources to the wrong section of the river. The men of the Ghost Army came home in 1945 and were immediately sworn to secrecy. The classification on their operations was not lifted until 1996. For 50 years, they sat at dinner tables and family gatherings and could not answer when someone asked what they had done in the war. The artists went back to painting, the designers went back to their studios, the sound engineers went back to their equipment, and the inflatable tanks that had helped change the course of a war sat in storage somewhere, slowly deflating, unknown to everyone.